This is part 3 on chapter 11, Islamic political ideologies. So moving on here, so this slide you can see is Islam today, speaking more in relation to modernism. So that's one of the main things that's really facing the Muslim community today is this deep division between those who accept modernization and those who reject it. So again, you're thinking about the Middle East of today, say the extremist group like ISIS or Al Qaeda, those types of groups. Obviously, they would be more in the camp that rejects modernization, whereas vast majority of the Muslims actually are leaning more towards the acceptance of modernization, new technology, that type of thing. So related to Islam, there's also this concept of Islamic liberalism or modernism, you can see here in parentheses. So this is the notion, again, like we've seen in other religions like Christianity or Judaism, where people argue that you can accept the idea that text can be reinterpreted to meet changing conditions. So although this has still often been more of the purview or more in relation to academics, not so much in the wider society. So some of these folks argue for more educational reform, reconciliation of reason and faith, gender equality, and so forth. But one of the problems that they've faced, again, they being Islamic liberals or those that adhere to Islamic liberalism, is that these ideas are often rejected as too Western. So they're kind of seen as sellouts or not really, true Muslims, something like that. So a lot of those that would try to inject more modernism into Islam have found that to be difficult at times. So continue on with Islam today. So I've just listed 3 different countries here. So Nasser, right, was the leader of Egypt back in the 1970s, who was overwhelmingly secular, but used Islamic symbols. So there was just sort of a little bit of a difference there. So again, it was still in that instance, we wouldn't really think about Egypt during that time as being theocracy. Excuse me. We would not think of Egypt being a theocracy, but it's instead secular. Although Islam still was an important part of it there. All right. So then moving on, so Libya. So you might have heard of this name. So Muammar Gaddafi. So he sort of had a unique version of Islam in his own country there. Kind of he had this idea of a green book where he kind of, again, changed some of the teachings and core tenets of Islam to kind of fit his needs a bit more. Now, of course, he was a ruthless dictator as well, and during the heyday of sort of the Arab Spring, he met his end. Was killed by rebel groups in Libya. So even though he was leader there for 42 years, he met a sort of very undignified ending, I guess you could say. So in the last one here, a lot of people think something similar could happen to Bashar al-Assad as well. So in Syria, he's been the leader of the Ba'ath Party, which has been seen as economically socialist. So although he's managed to hold on to power, even though the civil war has been waging in Syria for over 2 years, so over 150,000 people have died as a result of that. But a lot of folks, kind of argue the longer that might go on, the more of a chance he has to stay in power. So again, sometimes we see, again, people want to think about the Middle East and every, North Africa, Middle East, as being very similar, lots of the same stuff going on. But in reality, as you can see here, even though these 3 countries might be predominantly Islamic or predominantly Muslim, that very different things are going on as far as politics, political ideology, and all that sort of thing. All right, continuing on here with Islam today. We also want to look at Islamism. So again, this is a much more sort of conservative ideology. So this is the idea that they want to reestablish more of a strict form of Sharia, create Islamic theocracies. This really more of a full realization of the ideal Islamic community. Sort of they want to think about, well, what were things like really more around the time of the Prophet Muhammad? the kind of purity, all those type of things. Now, of course, in some ways, people would argue that how realistic would that really be to try to go back in time in some ways to have that full realization of an Islamic community, but it hasn't stopped them from trying. So another vocabulary term I wanted you to be aware of here, you can see here, Jahiliyyah, right? So this is the period of ignorance before Muhammad, right? So again, the Prophet Muhammad lived in the early 700s, or the 8th century, you could refer to it as well. So again, Muslims would kind of say that they were in this, sort of period of, kind of dark times or period of ignorance before the Prophet Muhammad came along, right? Because again, there was no Islam until he came to be. Right? So beforehand, they just had various other religions, or more ancient religions, going on in the Middle East. Many of those still exist today, but in much smaller forms. So, for example, the Yazidis you might have heard of, that were sort of stranded, on this mountain over in that neck of the woods. Again, that's a very sort of ancient religion, well before the time of the Prophet Muhammad. So, related to Islamism and politics in the region, you probably also heard of this group called the Muslim Brotherhood, or Ikhwan in Arabic, right? So this is a group that emphasizes both the return to traditions and scientific and technical education. So, again, they're not arguing for some sort of going back to the past. So they would be very comfortable with using modern technology, Facebook, cell phones, all these type of things. But on the same hand, or at the same time, they also want to turn to more traditional methods. So I put in here a parenthesis. So if you clicked on that, so you're probably familiar with this guy, Muhammad Morsi. So he was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood that led after Hosni Mubarak was overthrown, or kind of resigned from, just deposed from his office in February, I believe February 2011, and that kind of, again, the heyday of the Arab Spring. Egypt held elections, and Mohammed Morsi, you can see here, won that election. Now, of course, he was not in office for very long. The economy was collapsing, and people were, I think, sort of very uncomfortable with Morsi's leadership, and more directly the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood was therefore in power. So the military ended up deposing Morsi, and he's sort of been, we haven't really heard much from him since that time. But again, that's been a huge thing for Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood is a large group, right? The Islam, or the larger Islamist community in Egypt is a big group. So the current president used to be the highest general there, the Field Marshal al-Sisi. People have said, well, if they're really going to be able to move forward, and for things to go well there, he's got to somehow include the Muslim Brotherhood. Just trying to sort of ban them, like, so for the whole almost 30 years of Hosni Mubarak's rule, the Muslim Brotherhood were sort of suppressed, that were sort of kept out of Egyptian politics. So people say, if you really want to have a democracy, kind of a transparent political structure, that you can't just exclude certain groups, that you've got to somehow bring them into the mainstream political structure. All right. So again, Muslim Brotherhood's an important force today in many states throughout that region. Are continuing with the Islamism idea. So an interesting thing, if we're looking at the sort of Middle East, or more generally Islamic societies, that the Quran says that Allah is the only legislator. So in that perspective, any ruler, like a king or a president, prime minister, whoever that leader would be, under the Quran, under Islam, really says that any ruler like that should really just be an administrator, right? It's not really like a lawgiver, because they say, well, look, Allah is the only legislator, and the Quran and the Sharia and all those type of things, that should really be the law and so forth. Now, of course, that's sort of the more, in theory idea. In practice or in reality, of course, the rulers and other politicians have acted as lawgivers, or lawmakers, that type of thing. So again, it's sort of like, what the documents say might not necessarily be, what's going on in reality. So in many of the Muslim societies, we see that there's still this sort of social organization that's based on a traditional patriarchal family structure, right? So, again, with the man is sort of the head of the household, the provider, all that type of thing. So in this perspective, women should remain in just the private sphere. Only men are to act publicly. Although we have seen obviously a shift, away from this sort of idea where, women are taking political offices, being more involved in business, the economy, that type of thing. But the Islamists would argue that that should not be the case. So a very very strict interpretation of that would be in Afghanistan. So what we talked about at the beginning of the chapter, that in Afghanistan, they'd say women should not be educated at all, right? Because they say women should just remain in the private sphere, should be, homemakers, raise the children, that type of thing, where men would be the ones acting publicly. So again, related to Afghanistan, Pakistan area. So if you're not familiar with this term Taliban already, all right. So again, loose translation here would be students, where again, Talib would just be more the singular, just one student. Again, it's kind of a loose translation. So remember, this is a little bit different though, where the Taliban are not Arabs. So this is in a different area, more looking at South Asia, right, with Afghanistan, Pakistan, maybe a little bit in other areas. So this is largely a Pashtun group headed by this guy, Mullah Omar. So again, very kind of different folks, right, than we would think of in Saudi Arabia, Syria, some of those areas. So related to the Taliban, so remember we talked about that Jahiliyyah being a period of ignorance before Islam. So one of the things that some of the more extremist groups have been doing is sort of trying to eradicate or eliminate anything that sort of suggests that something else was going on there, right? So if we look at in Afghanistan in particular, one of the more awful things that the Taliban did during their when they had power in Afghanistan. You can see here I have a link here to so you can see this article titled "Bit by Bit, Afghanistan Rebuilds Buddhist Statues." So you can see these things are fascinating. So here you can see this image here. So yeah, the larger of two Buddha statues that towered over the Bamiyan Valley in central Afghanistan. Right, so you can see just how let's see, we have about 180. One stood nearly 180 feet tall, and the other about 120 feet tall. So you can see just kind of built into the side of this mountain here in central Afghanistan. So these are from the 6th century. So again, that would be about 200 years before the Prophet Muhammad comes along. So the Taliban destroyed some of these things. Again, it's hard to, they can try to restore some of this stuff, but in reality, it's never going to be the same like it was here. So again, very sort of unfortunate, thing that an extremely unfortunate thing that the Taliban did during their time in power there. So moving forward a little bit here, so turning over to this neck of the woods, so Islam in the United States. So I list here says 5 million adherents and growing. Some figures are closer to 8 million, but others say maybe those numbers are a little overstated, that maybe some, maybe it's actually more like 2 or 3 million. But in any case, I think, somewhere in this general area is a good idea. So there's actually over 2,000 mosques in the United States today. Now, of course, that pales in comparison to the number of churches, where there might be 2,000 churches just in New York City or something. So it might sound like a lot, but again, in a country of 320 million, that's not so dramatic. So we'll go ahead and stop here, and we'll continue on with this Islam in the U.S. slide in the next video.